tonight's guest speaker. I'm delighted to welcome tonight Commander Doug Stevens, RAN retired. Now I assume you've read the brief summary of Doug's career in the flyer for this evening, but that you might like to know just a little more of his career. He joined the RAN College in 1968 to be a seaman officer with a science degree, but transferred to electrical engineering to meet the college engineering student quota, believe it or not. He completed his degree over the next 3 years, living at the International House on the University of New South Wales campus in Sydney. Probably grew his hair long. After he obtained his bridge watchkeeping certificate and ocean navigation certificates aboard HMAS ships Melbourne and Brisbane in 1972, he trained in the UK at HMS Thunderer, Collingwood and Victory. I think that was the name of the establishment and not the old wooden one. He began repaying Navy for those many years of education and training in 1974 when he became, and I've got to use an acronym now and I'll use it again, WEO, Weapons Electrical Engineering Officer. He became the Deputy WEO of HMAS Torrens. Thereafter he held roles in Williamstown Dockyard. He was responsible for mechanical overhaul of guns, gun mounts, weapon directors, sonars and missile launchers. He was in Russell Officers in Canberra and the Directorate of Electronic Warfare. He was the WEO of HMAS Yarra. He was a trials officer in the RAN Trials Unit in Sydney. He was the WEO of HMAS Hobart. And his final permanent Navy role was as the Fleet WEO at Garden Island in Sydney. A significant portion of his role at that time was finding spare parts from international supply chains to keep our RAN guided missile frigates and destroyers at sea. In 1988, with the local design and build of the Anzac class frigates likely, Doug saw an opportunity to do something about it. By leaving the Navy and proving that we could design and build many systems in Australia, he felt he could improve the associated long-term sparing situation for weapons electrical systems in RAN ships. So in 1989, he started Stanlite Electronics branch in Western Australia. He recruited a local workforce and successfully tendered and delivered the communication system upgrade in HMAS Swan. In 1990, he moved to New Zealand to start Stanlite Electronics there, with the intention of designing and building a number of the communication subsystems in the Anzac frigates, hoping that Stanlite would be successful in winning the Anzac frigate contract. And they did. And along the way, they designed, built and delivered 11 shipsets of Anzac frigate communication subsystems and achieved a whole bunch of international standards in the process. And they had 75 locally recruited staff and 25 Australian Defence Force accredited subcontractors. So it's quite a sizable company. Excuse me. Unfortunately, they had a commercial business arm failed badly at around the time, and Doug found himself in New Zealand without a job, which he freely admitted. He joined Television New Zealand and worked in a variety of roles at that company for 15 years. And whilst he was with TVNZ, he helped design, build and operate New Zealand's integrated satellite and terrestrial digital TV and Freeview networks. Late in 2009, he became active in the RAN again, and for 9 years as a consultant in uniform, in effect, completed multiple submarine research studies and submarine staff officer roles, and finally retired from the RAN in 2018. He now works as a contract researcher and author of some of Defence's and Navy's emerging publications, with a major focus, I might say, on articulating seaworthiness regimes to meet modern standards. So I'm sure we will look forward to Doug's insights into the critical challenges of basing RAN submarines and the strategic thinking surrounding the locations, particularly now the government has decided to acquire nuclear-powered boats. Doug, over to you. Thank you.
much, Andrew, for that introduction. You know when I pen that you're going to read it all out. Anyway, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Are there any submariners in the room? When I was young, it was very easy to identify submariners in the room, but these days I find it particularly difficult. It's something to do with age, I think. The topic tonight is a little bit different from what was advertised. What was advertised was submarine basing. It's a general topic, picking up on a report that I did in 2011, which is here, which looked at, it was just a generic look at where we might base the future submarines. At that time, RADM Moffitt commissioned me to get on and do it. He was the head of the Future Submarine Program at that time, and he was very concerned about the inability of the RAN to properly crew the 6 submarines that it had, and he did his own study and determined that large part of that was because the only submarine base was on the west coast, and that was a de-enabler, firstly of people wanting to join the submarine force, but once they'd actually joined, causing them to, once they trained, to think, I don't know that I want to spend my whole career in Rockingham, 2 hours south of Perth. There must be more to life in the Navy than this. So they try to leave the submarine force, or they left the Navy altogether. This is all about submarines. Here's a model of a Collins class. A thing of beauty and a joy to behold. Who would think just a simple black tube would strike fear into the hearts of men? But they do. They do. This slide shows a submarine at periscope, just coming out of periscope depth in Jarvis Bay. It looks stealthy. Stealth is the fundamental characteristic of submarines that causes them to be sought after. Every country in the world that has a sea coast recognises that it needs submarines. Most either have them or are in the course of acquiring them. This little chart up here shows the roles of submarines from the level of violence against the probability of occurrence. So right at the top are the roles of submarine in peacetime. Forward presence, surveillance and deterrence. As a crisis develops, they take a role of area denial and progressively goes up to full-scale global war, where it's unrestricted submarine warfare. Submarines against submarines, land strike weapons, firing Tomahawk or other missiles at land bases, and shooting down all those grey-painted warships that think they can hunt submarines successfully. Anti-submarine warfare is a capability of the RAN that I think everyone here who's had any recent naval experience would say is atrophied, and that's being kind. Now, what I'm about to say here is a mix of fact, speculation, personal opinion based on research, and a little bit of hearsay thrown in. I don't in any way speak for Defence or Navy, and in fact, since I submitted that report, which went into a black hole, nobody has spoken to me about it officially since. So, whatever you do, don't hold the Department of Defence responsible. So it's fact that on the 7th of March this year, our Prime Minister announced 3 shortlisted East Coast home port options for AUKUS submarines. And so the announcement that we're going to have nuclear-propelled submarines instead of diesel-electric-propelled submarines had already been announced. It's also a fact that at that time it was reported that Navy's preferred option for the East Coast Submarine Base was Port Kembla, is Port Kembla. It's hearsay that in the last week or two I've heard that the company Ernst Young has been given the task of building that base, which is not altogether surprising since Rear Admiral Rowan Moffitt, the man who tasked me to write that initial report, is associated with Ernst Young, as is a former head of naval engineering, Commodore Rick Longbottom. What's not clear to me yet is where the home port will actually be. It's reasonable to assume that it will be Port Kembla, I think. But the port ultimately selected will have to be the one which best satisfies Australia's nuclear safety requirements. I'll elaborate shortly. But firstly, why must we have an East Coast submarines base? So I mentioned Rear Admiral Moffitt's studies and his recognition that having only one submarine base on the west coast, 2 hours south of Perth, was a disincentive to recruiting and retention of the submarine workforce. And that's the principal reason today, and it's recognised. And particularly in the climate where every industry in the country is struggling to recruit skilled workers. Doesn't matter what the industry is, there aren't enough people with the skills that everyone needs. So it's particularly challenging for defence right now. Before we were in this situation, it's going to be harder now. But 80% of the population of Australia, 80% of the workforce, 80% of the people who join the Navy come from this southeast corner of Australia. So just for that reason alone, we need to have a base here so they don't feel like they're going to be alone. Now, there is some posting diversity opportunity between West Coast and East Coast, just like there is for the surface Navy, like there always has been. Other reasons are just diversity. The more diversity you have in any industry, with the people who work for you, the types of people, the psychological profiles, basing, office distribution, the more diversity, the stronger the company will be. The two-ocean basing policy. Australia has had a two-ocean basing policy for decades. It pays lip service to it when it suits, and that's why we've only got one base when we should have had two, servicing both coasts. Avoidance of the Indonesian archipelago choke points. So submariners will know there's only a few places with a Collins-class submarine where you can get through to head further north. And increasingly, Indonesia is insisting that all military vessels that transit through its economic zone announce its presence so that they can monitor. And of course that's the last thing the submarine wants to do. With the larger submarines that we're about to acquire, it's going to be more difficult for them to go through those choke points. So having a base on the east coast that can avoid archipelago choke points and head up around the eastern New Guinea is desirable. Better weather. It just so happens that the Port of Fremantle has the worst weather in the country. Great place for a naval base. See the peak wave heights off Fremantle are the worst in the country. The second worst is Adelaide, which is where the submarine's built. And better battle-worthiness preparation. So battle-worthiness is a term used today for the preparation of Australian warships and submarines. It's basically a licensing program. It's a tiered, graded set of exercises. You work up, it's coming out of a refit, progressively get better and more practice. The crew become more familiar with their vessel, their platform. And the final stage of the preparation is battle-worthy phase 2, where the fleet training group have assessed and determined that the particular ship or submarine is ready to deploy and meet any mission tasking that may arise. It's better battleworthiness on the east coast because there are more resources. That's all there is to it. The Fleet Air Arm, the Air Force out of within town, more ships operating out of Sydney, and increasingly submarines are using the islands in Bass Strait to simulate littoral warfare, and they use that area down there for their new locally designed and implemented submarine perishables command course. So, what's a submarine home port? Well, a submarine home port is not a maintenance facility. It's not a forward base, operating base. Darwin might be a forward operating base. Darwin is a good forward operating base potentially. But a submarine home port is where the families and friends are, where the submarine force is integrated into a support community that includes access to all necessary human resources, administration, technology, maintenance, logistics, operations, research, and the local civilian community generally. This slide, busy, summarises all of the, or many of the characteristics. You've got administration, you've got physical security, that's both around the base and in the case of submarines, one of the other things about submarines is different from surface ships. Submarines are vulnerable on the surface. They can't defend themselves, and the quicker they can get to deep water, the better. But with nuclear submarines, certainly Britain and the US do it, they have escort. When a submarine is heading into sea, it's escorted by surface warships or ships which at least can help it in the case of attack. It's close to fleet and commercial shipping, just as I was implying in terms of working up. Submarines operating out of the west have very light shipping density opportunities. To hone the skills, become battle-worthy, they need all the merchant ships operating in and out of Sydney and plying their trade down to Melbourne with containers and so on. They need to be familiar working in an environment. We've got all of these linguistic signatures coming in. Personnel and infrastructure support, extended families, friends, maintenance, ammunition. So the base in Western Australia is particularly good in the context of ammunition. It's got an ammunition facility on the island. Submarines there don't have to go very far to load up with ammunition before they deploy. On the east coast, there's just the one ammunition facility. It's a twofold bay, or Eden. And that means every ship submarine operating on the east coast, before it goes anywhere, it needs to come down to Eden and pick up some weapons. Deep water berths. So this is a comparative image showing a Collins-class submarine landing helicopter dock, DDG, FFG, and an Anzac-class frigate. And it shows how much underwater, how much exists of a Collins-class submarine underwater. Collins-class submarine means the same water depth alongside as the LHD. The new submarines add an extra 3 metres to the Collins-class requirement. So deep water berths are going to be a fundamental requirement going forward. And of course, so this slide shows the relative length of the 3 submarine classes. We don't know yet whether we're going to get a Virginia class, that's the US submarine, or an Astute class, that's the Royal submarine, or whether it's going to be a bespoke design aided by the designers of UK and the US, who may come out to help. It'll be a little while yet before we know. March next year is when we're advised we're going to get the report which explains how it's all going to be done. So, actually, I'll go back to here. What I haven't explained yet or discussed the nuclear safety considerations. So the thing that's different about working about where we're going to place the nuclear submarine, nuclear propelled submarines, which we are about to get or commit to, is nuclear propulsion. And there are very strict rules in existence in Australia relating to visits by nuclear propelled warships. And those rules are defined by a panel, visiting ships panel, brackets nuclear, that exists solely for defining Australian government or advising the Australian government on requirements for visits by nuclear propelled warships. And there is an operations publication which identifies where in Australia nuclear propelled warships can tie up alongside a wharf, and where they may moor and where they may anchor. And there aren't many of them. In fact, the only ports where nuclear propelled warships are allowed to come alongside are Gladstone, Brisbane, and Fleet Base West in Western Australia. They hardly ever go to Gladstone these days. Gladstone is just fully occupied with delivering liquefied natural gas. But they do come to Brisbane, and they of course do go to HMAS Stirling. Elsewhere, there are provisions but there are anchorages. There's an anchorage in the mainstream in Darwin. There's an anchorage in Jarvis Bay, believe it or not. There's an anchorage two anchorages in Port Phillip Bay, south of Williamstown, the middle of Port Phillip Bay. And there are 3 anchorages in Western Australia, 1 off Fremantle and 2 down in Albany. I should say that was the last time I looked at this operations document, which defined where they are. It may have been updated since I looked at it, which is 10 years ago. So it might have changed, but they existed then. But in order for them to be used, it's up to the state governments to say, yes, you can visit, because the state governments have to run the organisations that support radiation monitoring. They need to have procedures and processes in place which will enable evacuation of people in the immediate vicinity. Navy has to have tugs standing by, because the requirements are that if there is a reactor incident, or if the disposal of nuclear waste processes and procedures fall down, the vessel involved has to be towed to a safe mooring within a defined period of time. So all of that needs to be in place, and so that those criteria meant that the options that arose out of the first basing study had to be reduced. You would not base nuclear propelled warships within the harbour of a major city like Sydney, and that impacts this shortlist too, and reinforces, I think, why Navy has chosen, or said that it was, Port Kembla as its preferred option. So on to the individual ports, 3 options. This is the image of, and it's a recent image, of the Fisherman's Island complex, Port of Brisbane. All of this is reclaimed land. There's some islands here, which are called Fisherman's Islands, but all of this is from dredge spoil that's been fished up, dug up alongside the wharf area of that port, of that wharf complex, but also the channel, which goes all the way up. So that facility there is this piece here on this chart, and this is the distance, this is the channel that has to be dredged. This is Caloundra up here, Point Cartwright, anybody who's familiar with the Brisbane coast. So that dredge spoil is filling up that landmass, and when it's full, but it's not far off it now, the costs of operating that port are going to skyrocket, because the dredge spoil will then have to be taken by barge out to sea, as opposed to just being pumped into that wharf facility now. So the Port of Brisbane is, as you can see, it's on the Brisbane River, which, as we all know, floods from time to time. And when it floods, a whole lot of debris, walkways, logs and other rubbish comes down into the port, which means the port has to close for a while whilst it is cleared. So, this is the Brisbane River, winding its way up into the centre of the city. The nearest defence infrastructure is just up the river a little way at a place called Bulimba. It's called Bulimba Barracks. It was a logistics centre for Army mainly, and Navy has a small presence there. Between Bulimba and the port, Austal, the shipbuilders from Western Australia, have taken over a ship repair facility there, a small ship slipway, and they are repairing small ships. I think they bought that place quite wisely, anticipating that some business from Navy may come their way. Port of Brisbane is on the shortlist, so who knows, they might get a chunk of business. Deepwater transit. So I mentioned that submarines on the surface are vulnerable, and when I started this basing study, I got a specification from submarine commanding officers on what was the ideal home port. And a key part of that specification was that it takes no more than 2 hours at 10 knots, so 20 nautical miles, to get to the 100 metre contour. That is 100 metres of water, so they could dive into deep water. So 2 hours was the upper limit. The Port of Brisbane, noting that the draft of the submarines is 7.2 for Collins class, and it's 10 metres for the choice for either of the Virginia class or the Spip class, have to transit all the way up to Caloundra. So from here, all the way up to Caloundra before heading east down into deep water. That takes 7 hours. 7 hours transit to deep water is a major turn-off for submarine commanding officers in the context. It's all right for a visit, but not much good if you want to do daily running, working up your submarine. Strategic transit. So of the three options, Brisbane is the closest to Australia's strategic areas of interest. So that's a plus for the Port of Brisbane. East Australian exercise area transit. So I mentioned earlier the working up of submarines coming out of maintenance period. The crews in the submarines have to get used to each other again and work their way up to become battle worthy. And for that to happen, on the east coast of Australia, it happens within what's called the East Australia Exercise Area, which extends basically from Newcastle down to Twofold Bay. It's about 500 nautical miles from Brisbane to get into the working part of the East Australian Exercise Area. So that's quite a challenge. Also in Moreton Bay, there are jellyfish blooms occur 2 or 3 times a year. It may be more. And the aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan was forced into an emergency reactor shutdown in the Port of Brisbane in 2016 after it sucked up more than 800 kilogram of jellyfish into its condensers. Not desirable. One particular advantage that Port of Brisbane has over the other 2 options is that it is already authorised to bring nuclear-propelled warships alongside, both aircraft carriers and submarines. Anybody got any questions before I move on?
I have a question. Why was Brisbane authorised? What made it? Was it lack of population, or why did it get a tick in the box for nuclear?
Because there's nobody around. So the fundamental requirements are that if there is an incident, that the vessel can be towed to a safe anchorage. But this port already is a safe anchorage because there's nobody at the time, and all we've got now is actually port facilities. There are there are residences around here, residential accommodation, but it's far enough away to meet the requirements of the visiting ship Naval nuclear. What has to be put in place by the state government if there's a new nuclear propelled warship visit is radiation monitoring. The police force, the emergency services all need to be aware of what they're going to do if there's an incident. They are supposed to practice it every now and again, and Brisbane City was happy to do it. John mentioned earlier that he thought that Queensland government and Victorian government decided they weren't going to allow it, but I'm aware there have been visits to Brisbane in recent years. Well, 2016, for example. Okay, Port of Newcastle. So, I took this photo out of the window of an aircraft. It's obviously a bright day and a clean window that I was looking at. And it shows well the Port of Newcastle. So, you can see the river mouth, the mouth, which actually is the mouth of the harbour and also the Hunter River. This is the Hunter River, I'm going around here. This basin area was identified in the first report as being a good potential location for a submarine home port. There's a marine facility, repair facility here. This floating dock no longer is there, but this facility basically services these pleasure yachts. There's no real shipbuilding in Newcastle anymore. And this area here has become very trendy. Go down there for brunch and coffee and so on. But this area and this facility here, when I visited, they had this identified and reserved for a cruise ship terminal, but decided not to do that anymore. But the issue that I see here for Newcastle is that it's surrounded by residential accommodation and light industry here. That one of the key considerations in any potential nuclear incident is the direction of the prevailing winds. The strength of the winds and the direction they're coming from. And that determines where the impact is going to be felt most, and that's where evacuation has to happen. Now, southeast trade winds are the predominant, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's southeast, coming this way, and most likely to be blowing any fission products or whatever there may be in the atmosphere over that land. So essentially, Port of Newcastle is not altogether unlike Sydney Harbour in that where you might berth the submarines, have the base is surrounded by people. So I think that, as much as anything else, will cause, or has caused, Port of Newcastle not to be favoured. A lot of people have an intuitive, or provided intuitive support for the Port of Newcastle. They think, hey, why not Port of Newcastle? I think that reason alone is why it's not going to get up and win the day. Also, the Hunter River floods, of course, like the Port of Brisbane, like the Brisbane River. Similar quantities of rubbish come down. Certainly it would flow down the river and out the mouth, but the tidal effect will cause debris to come back here and interfere with any activity you've got here. And you wouldn't try to get submarines out where there's a prospect of fouling seawater intakes. Deepwater transit, it's only 1 hour to Deepwater from Newcastle, so that's good. Maintenance, there's no maintenance here currently. Newcastle is 2.5 hours, or this part of Newcastle is 2.5 hours drive from Sydney. There's plenty of support from Sydney, but whether a base could be established here that could support local maintenance, don't know. Plenty of defence facilities within the town, of course, but it's all aviation focused. But the necessary support for personnel, health, and related infrastructure is all there, so that could easily be adapted. Weather, weather-induced sea state conditions cause this port to close for a total of about 144 hours every year. Not all at once, of course, but nevertheless, it happens. It's a combination of high tide, winds, sea state, and the port is closed. That's even to the big coal carriers. And I've already mentioned the nuclear safety element. Port Kembla, so I didn't take this photo, and it's not a good one. It's not sharp, but it's the only one I could find that shows the whole waterway. So, in my original report, I discounted Port Kembla because it was full, and everywhere I looked, the New South Wales government had plans for it. There was going to be a new grain terminal, and there was no spare space. There was no wharf opportunity. There were no wharf opportunities, but certainly everything that I looked at was related to the inner harbour. That's this area here. The New South Wales government today, and it's still very busy, and I think all of that wharf space and the inner harbour is taken, and there are clients lining up to take it when somebody moves out. And New South Wales government is developing this for the overflow container business once the Port of Putney fills up. So it's a busy little port. But the outer harbour, as you can see, is largely unutilised. And the New South Wales government identifies that that's an area for future development. And I'm speculate that that's where Navy wants the future AUKUS submarine home port to be. It would be easy access, easy exit in the event of any incident, also from a tactical point of view. It will be relatively easier to dredge and keep deep than the inner harbour. And I don't know, but it seems to me that that's where it's going to be, and I look forward to hearing when it's formally announced. Now, the Port Kembla is fed by a river or a creek, like the other two. It comes down here. It's called Elms Creek, but it hasn't got anywhere near the water volumes of the Hunter River or the Brisbane River. It does flood, but once again the volumes are low. Defence infrastructure. The nearest defence facility is Navy's Hydrographic Service in Wollongong. I should have said, by the way, that Port Kembla is a suburb. In formal terms, it's a suburb of the city of Wollongong. To the south is Nowra, with the HMAS Albatross Fleet Aviation Facility. That's about an hour's drive south. And then further south is Jarvis Bay, of course. There's no infrastructure, though, capable of undertaking maintenance. But as you can see, there's a lot of land there on which a ship lift and supporting shed could be built. Deep water transit is also about an hour, so it's the same as Newcastle. East Australian Exercise Area Transit, it's part of the Port Kembla is within the East Australian Exercise Area, and it's also very close to Jarvis Bay, and it's the closest of the options to the ammunition facility at Eden. It's the closest to Lucas Heights and feeder universities, such as it is the centre of nuclear expertise in Australia. It's on the southern side of Sydney, and of course it will expand beyond that. But the Sydney University and the University of New South Wales have already introduced courses in nuclear engineering, and the expertise of Lucas Heights facility is, if you like, it's at the nucleus of what is evolving. Nuclear safety. So if you take a look at this photo and think southeast prevailing winds over a base facility here and all of this infrastructure here, industrial, lightly populated. I think you can see why I think that of the three port options, so, sorry, there's not an issue at Port of Brisbane. It's sparse, there's nothing around the walls, only water, so it satisfies the nuclear safety requirements. Port of Newcastle doesn't, but I think Port Kembla, although it has no rating currently that I'm aware of, will come out highly when it is reviewed by the Visiting Ships Panel on Nuclear. And this is a little chart at the end which just, if you're not already aware, highlights just where Port Kembla is relative to Newcastle, Sydney and Jarvis Bay. So, Port Kembla, Nara, Fleet Air Aviation, Jarvis Bay, there is an anchorage there already, which is for nuclear submarines. It's around about here, and that's important in terms of submarines working up, come in after daily serials, you can anchor, cover for the night, head out next morning. Richmond, so Newcastle is, sorry, Nora head there, Newcastle is there. This is up to the northern end of East Australian exercise area, and down here is the ammunition facility. So, any questions?
Doug, the transit time out of Port Kembla to deep water is
1 hour?
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, in fact, so you can see on this chart the 100 metre line is around here, basically. Around here. So it gets out, and then elsewhere in Australia it goes quite a bit further out.
Somebody who is not here as a senior defence policy officer, I think you've done a remarkable good job in dodging all the senior defence policy questions and issues, because clearly this was not just about submarine basing. There are a whole bunch of other complexities and nuances surrounding the types of submarines and their physical characteristics and timelines for construction and so on. Thank you very much for a very enlightening dissertation. I really appreciate it. I'm sure we will do. And I guess we'll all sit back with bated breath and see what happens around about March as to know what comes next. As you say, whether it's the defence review outcome or whether it's the decision on the submarine or how they're interwoven. It's a fascinating discussion over where they're best based, and I confess from a personal perspective I agree that Port Kembla is the logical solution. I think the other factor that probably argued against Jarvis Bay was also the lack of proximate industry base as well. Whereas Newcastle has a lot going for it. Not Newcastle, Wollongong, Port Kembla has it going for it in terms of the proximate industrial workforce, but also proximity to Sydney, where so much of the training infrastructure exists as well, and fleet command headquarters and blah blah. So it'll be a very interesting decision. Thank you very much anyway.